Excellent. Okay, and we are live here. Excellent. Hello, Portal to Ascension community. We are back for another live interview today. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to this broadcast. My name is Raji from houseofraji.com. I just joined the PTA team if you're wondering who I am, and I'm really excited to be with you today. I'm a professional video journalist born and raised in Toronto, Canada, and I'm also a spiritual empowerment coach. And I hope to really just connect and support this community of evolving souls to the best of my highest abilities. And I look forward to more co-creation with you all. So thank you for having me. Now, today is going to be fun. Today, we're talking Irish folklore, fairies, and the supernatural. Yesterday, we spoke with John Russell, a world-renowned psychic and paranormal investigator. He broke down a bit of his own process and practical spirituality. That video is now on our YouTube channel, and I suggest you guys check it out. It was also a lot of really interesting information. Well, John will be a presenter, just like our guest today, at the upcoming Paranormal Magic and Ancient Folklore Conference here on Portal to Ascension. I'm going to share the flyer with you so you can see what I'm talking about. Here it is. And yep, as you can see, it is coming up on July the 10th, and you can get your tickets today at portaltoascension.org. It's going to be great, really great speakers, just like our guest today. And I can't wait to bring her on here. Morgan Daimler is the author of more than 2 dozen books on subjects relating to Irish mythology, paganism, and fairies. She has contributed to multiple anthologies and magazines, as well as taught workshops on these topics across the United States and the world. She is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to folklore and beyond. Morgan, thank you so much for being here today. So excited to have you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, me too. Okay, let's jump right in because we have a lot of topics to cover. But first, I would really love to know how you kind of got into these topics. Like, was there an experience that happened for you?
Sure. So I think my case maybe is a little unusual. I guess everyone though has an unusual story to start with. But for me, you know, I, as a child, had a lot of experiences when I was very young. And I was sort of fortunate in that I grew up in a family that didn't encourage that sort of thing, but also didn't discourage it.
Okay.
My parents took a very sort of neutral view. And I grew up as part of the Irish American diaspora, which has sort of a slightly different belief in the fairies that you would find in Ireland, but similar. And I think those things kind of combined so that when I was talking to my parents when I was very little and telling them that I was seeing fairies and having experiences with them, that there was sort of an acceptance of it, which I'm really fortunate, I think, and I'm grateful for that now, because I think things would have been very different for me.
Yeah.
If I had been discouraged when I was very young. So I was, 5, 6 years old and outside building little fairy houses. And when I was a little older, I was writing letters to the fairies and leaving them on my windowsill. I mean, I was an interesting child.
Yeah.
I think is where I'm going with this.
Nice. Yeah. That's awesome. I think a lot of us here we're interesting children. So, sorry, do you want to please finish?
No, I was just gonna say it's the best kind of child.
Yeah, right.
Interesting ones.
Totally. So when most people think of fairies, they think of like cute, winged, little children. And, I'm thinking of the Tooth Fairy or Tinkerbell and stuff. Now, how true to form is that?
I could get off on a whole sidetrack about the Tooth Fairy, but I'm going to try to rein myself in. It's interesting because the word sort of now has 2 different usages. So we definitely see people using the word fairy, and they mean that sort of what you just described, the kind of smaller winged sprite, often very childlike, just very Tinkerbell. But the older usage and sort of the more widespread in different cultures and, in a lot of the academic material, is fairy is sort of used as a general term. It's sort of for any being that is from the land of fairy, from the other world, from an alternate reality, if you will, that comes into our world and then interacts with people. So when we look at older material and older sources, and if you talk to people in cultures that still have these active beliefs, when they're talking about fairies, they can be talking about things that are very human-like, human sized, human in appearance, but just have this sort of magical nature, magical quality to them and connection to this other world. They can be talking about cats and dogs, because we have a lot of folklore about that sort of thing. Horses. I mean, it's a much wider range, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So we're talking like trolls, dragons, elves. Like, do they all fall under the scope of fairy?
Not dragons necessarily. I think dragons are kind of considered their own sort of category, but trolls, elves, goblins, all of that sort of thing, depending on, again, sort of which local folklore we're looking at. But like in Scotland, trolls, trows would be considered a type of fairy. Elves, the word elf and fairy were used interchangeably in England up until very recently, actually. So yeah, definitely that would all kind of fall under that same category.
Nice. You mentioned, the folklore. So why is it important? Why is it important to learn about and listen to folklore and folk belief from cultures like Ireland?
That is sort of like the core question here, I guess. And you'll get arguments, I will say up front, like people have different opinions, but I think really when we're talking about something like fairies, or anything of a similar nature, the folklore is like a guidebook to human experiences with these beings for as long as we have records. So when you're talking about Ireland, obviously they don't call them fairies in Irish. Fairies is the English word, but we have accounts of them going back 1,500 years. And you can kind of look at all this material, and then you can look at the way people are still interacting with them and still encountering them today. And it gives you a much better picture, I think, than what we can find, for example, in like fiction or Hollywood movies or that sort of commercialized material that we get that's not looking to tell a true story in the sense of like, this is an encounter someone actually had that's been passed down, but to just tell something for entertainment or, for a different sort of purpose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get that. So, okay, that's really interesting. Now, when I think of the word fairy, like something else comes to mind, and tell me how true this is. So a fairy, like you can have someone ferry you across the way, across a river, across an idea. How does the notion of fairy, the one that you're speaking about, connect, if it does, to what I'm speaking about?
Sure. I think conceptually, there's a lot of similarities to the words. The words are homonyms, so they have different meanings in history. They just sound the same. But I think the idea of what you're talking about, that sort of, even as if we look at it as a verb, idea of bringing someone somewhere across something, that can definitely connect in, I would say, to the concept of fairies. You might not necessarily always want to go where they're bringing you. Because one thing I do always tell people when we're talking about the subject is that, not all fairies are necessarily what we would call good or helpful to humans. Some of them are sort of dangerous, but they definitely, when they have encounters with humans, there seems to be some wider purpose to it, whether it's helping the fairy or, giving something to the human or teaching the human a lesson, which again, they might not always enjoy. Even the dangerous ones, sometimes, the point to that is don't go to certain places or, don't be disrespectful, don't be rude. So there's always that verb in there, that ferrying, as in bringing you to something.
Interesting. And how do fairies relate to elementals?
It's a good question. It's actually kind of funny because I've been doing this, as I kind of said, for quite a while.
Yeah.
I was interested in it in my childhood, and then when I hit my teens is when I really started studying the folklore. I've been publicly speaking and teaching about fairies since 2000. So kind of been around the community for a bit. And really the idea of elementals is something that's a little bit newer. I think I've mostly noticed it in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think to a degree, it's people trying to find a word to describe the way I would use the word fairy. Those beings that are more maybe potentially dangerous, more primal, not the little winged version of fairies. Elementals in the truest sense, as in where the term comes from, because it comes from alchemy. Paracelsus, I think, was the first one to use it. I'm not an alchemist, so I might be misattributing that to him. He's the first one I'm aware of using it. He saw everything in relation to 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and had kind of created this system wherein each of those elements was ruled by an elemental being. So fire is the salamander, water is Undina, which is a kind of water spirit. Air was sylphs, which is what we think of when we say fairy for most people. And then earth was the gnome, which is exactly what you would think of when you hear the word gnome in in North America. And so he kind of created that concept, and then it sort of hit theosophy in the late 1800s into the 1900s. And that's where I think it got expanded into what we think of more as elementals now, which are beings that sort of embody and personify an element. And it kind of got broadened out from those 4 very specific types. And you do see a lot of people now who will kind of say all fairies are, fairies, again, the way I would use the term, that more general concept, are a type of elemental being. So it gets very convoluted and tangled.
Nuanced a little bit. Okay. So it sounds like there's like a hierarchy in some regard, or no?
Yes, in both concepts, actually. In elementals, there definitely is, and there's kings and queens of each element and each type of being and all of that. But in the wider concept of fairy as well, we see that same kind of hierarchy. So we see talks about like fairy kings and fairy queens, and this sort of idea that they exist in a society, and that society kind of has levels and rules to it. And actually a lot of the things that we know about like human interactions with them, what we call fairy etiquette, are sort of based on the folklore and what it tells us about that those rules, and sort of how to behave, because the way their society works, the way everything is structured with fairies is different from humans. So things that humans might do might get fairies very upset,
right,
and not work out well for a human who's interacting with them. So you kind of have to look at it as a completely different foreign culture, but there is that hierarchy to it. There are those levels,
right. And speaking of interacting, do you summon fairies? Do you invite fairies? Do you request them?
The answer to that would kind of be yes, depending on what approach you're taking. So for the majority of people, just your average daily person, you would just kind of try to stay on the good side. And there's a lot of good side of the fairies, I should say. Not that interacting with fairies is bad, but stay on their good side. And we have a lot of protections against them for people who just kind of want to not get into all of that. But we also do have a lot of folklore material for people who do interact with them more directly. And some of that would include friendly invitations, sort of putting out that you're open to those experiences, If you get more into like the ceremonial magic end of things, we have grimoire material from like the 16th and 17th century that includes invocations. There's super fun, really complex, take like 3 days to do them kind of things. But yeah, so I mean, historically, all of that was done. I think in modern times, all of that is still done.
Yeah.
Depending on the person. So.
Okay, interesting. And speaking of modern times, and I want to go to the purpose of rerouting roads in Ireland and Iceland and how that all came about.
Yeah, so those are some of my favorite stories too to tell.
Yeah, it's so good.
A lot of people aren't aware of it.
I know.
So there's a strong belief in both Ireland and Iceland, and obviously other places as well, but those two in specific, that certain locations and certain types of objects belong to what we would call fairies, to the fairies. So in Iceland, it's usually boulders, large rocks. They call them Alfakirkjan, which literally means like elf churches. But the idea is that they use that boulder, sort of, they inhabit it, or they use it as a portal. They can pass through it. And so it belongs to them. So you don't want to move it or mess with it, because then they'll get offended and upset, which is a little different in Iceland versus Ireland, because the Icelandic, the Alfar, the Huldafolk, the elves, or the hidden folk, are a little more lenient than the Irish fairies would be. But there's been cases where, and there was one, you can look this up as it was in the news, where a road was rerouted in Iceland because there was one of these elf stones, these elf churches, and they didn't want to move it. There was actually a big protest about it. There's other stories though that you can find about, there was a company that was digging a well, and the equipment started breaking, and the men who were working started hearing music and voices and things, and so they stopped and moved to a slightly different location, and they didn't have any problems. So they sort of assumed they must have been somewhere near an elf location. There was another account, and this one was also in the news, with a roadway that was being built, and it wasn't that they had to move the elf stone, but it was close enough when they were doing the construction that a lot of dirt kind of got thrown on it.
Yeah.
And again, people started having experiences and hearing music and voices and noises, badly enough that like the closest town, the people were the ones who told the construction company, like, you have to fix this.
Wow.
Yeah, because it's not just one person experiencing it, it's the whole population.
Yeah.
So they ended up going up and clearing all the dirt off the stone and making it nice and pretty again, and like, fixing the whole area around it.
Yeah.
And these are all things you can find in the news. I mean, it's not just me, you can verify them.
But like, how did they know? Like, are these marked boulders and stuff, or no?
In Iceland, they have people who, and I'm not going to remember the term in Icelandic for them, but they basically can communicate with the elves, or the elves communicate with them. Let me just grab a quick.
Yeah.
I have really bad seasonal allergies. And where I live, everything is pollinating right now.
Right.
So
Where are you in the world, by the way? Where are you joining us from?
Connecticut.
Connecticut.
In the US.
Nice.
So
yeah,
everything's pollinating here.
Yeah.
But you have people in Iceland who are basically specialists and communicate. If you look up the story, particularly about the road through the lava field that was rerouted because of the elf stone, part of why that happened is because this woman came in who is one of these specialists and was relaying messages from the elves, and sort of explaining why they didn't want the stone moved and why the road couldn't go through a certain portion of it. So that's sort of how that happens there. In Ireland, it's a little bit different. In Ireland, it's not so much stones, it's usually trees. They're called fairy trees, and they're almost always a lone hawthorn, which I think when you tell people this, if you're not really kind of familiar with how things work in Ireland, it doesn't make sense. But generally, you don't find a hawthorn growing by itself. They like to grow in like hedges and groves and big groups. So when you only find one alone, it's kind of unusual and strange. And particularly in fields with like livestock, you don't just get one tree surviving. They either all get destroyed or, you know, a bunch of them make it. So whenever you see like this lone hawthorn tree in a field, particularly, but kind of anywhere, it's sort of known and understood that this is probably going to be a fairy tree. And a lot of them do have local folklore about them. Like people will tell stories about things that have happened with this particular tree. You know, sometimes it's, you know, that to their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation. Sometimes it's very recent. But it's just something people sort of know. So there was a road in the 1990s, a highway project that was rerouted. Again, this is a very, very famous, so you can find it in the news. I think it actually made the news in England and in the US at the time.
Okay.
And they were going to have to cut down this particular fairy tree. And there was sort of a big outcry about it. And Eddie Lenihan, who is a very famous storyteller in Ireland, sort of spearheaded this movement to get the road rerouted to not cut down the tree. Because the problem, particularly in Ireland, when you cut down a fairy tree or dig into a fairy hill, which is another location connected to them, is very bad things tend to happen to the people associated with it. So yeah, there's a very strong belief that like if you cut down one of these trees, you are probably not going to have a lot of good fortune, or, you know, potentially not a long lifespan. There's another famous story to do with the DeLorean car company. The reason that it failed and went into bankruptcy is they built a plant in Ireland, and in the process of building it, cut down a fairy tree. And within a year, the entire company had gone bankrupt and out of business.
Wow.
So yeah, people take it very seriously.
Yeah, it's like, and that's so different from North America. Like, how does that make you feel knowing like those countries, like, you know, have a level of respect for these beings and the relationship that they possess with humans, whereas, you know, in North America, I'm from Canada, and it's just not the same. So how do you reconcile that, or how does that make you feel?
I mean, it makes me feel kind of sad, to be honest. I wish that we all sort of had that respect for the other beings that are around us, you know. And I don't want to sound like super militant animistic here, but even animals, you know, humans tend to just always look at humans as the priority in everything, which often does not work out well for us. You know, a lot of the problems that cities have with things like flooding have to do with not really looking at nature and how nature intended certain things to work, and then we mess up drainage and all kinds of things and cause our own problems. But I mean, it's a little weird for me, I think, because I did grow up with some of the beliefs in the diaspora. Again, they're a little different here in Ireland. For example, like you would always protect against fairies and you would ward them out of your house.
Right.
In the Irish American diaspora, and I have my theories about why this is, but there's much more of an idea that it's sort of good fortune to have them around you, and that it's not a bad thing if you experience things in your home. So that's sort of a different angle to it. But, you know, I grew up, my grandfather would pour out the first bit of his beer on the ground outside for the fairies, which is actually something we also see in Ireland. That's a folk belief there, like they're owed sort of that initial bit out of respect. Any food that drops on the ground, it's thought to be, you know, them claiming it, so you would give it to them. There's no 5-second rule.
There's no 5-second rule.
No. I tell my kids that all the time. Like when they drop food, I'm like, oh, the fairies want it. To give it to them.
It's all good. And so how do fairies play into modern urban legends?
That is an excellent question. So obviously folklore is a subject that fascinates me. And definitely an aspect of that is urban legends, which I don't think that people maybe appreciate enough. Like, at least not my generation. We definitely tend to look at urban legends like, oh, they're just like silly stories. Like, why would you ever believe that? But a lot of urban legends, I think, are rooted at least in some way in someone's experience.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that we see, particularly more recently, like the black-eyed children, I definitely think have at least some of that fairy energy to them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of debate. For those of you who aren't familiar, since I just kind of opened the subject up with black-eyed children, it's a modern urban legend. It's come about in the last 20 years or so of people talking about having experiences where it's usually a pair of children whose eyes are completely black, no iris, just pupil, usually dressed in lighter colors or white with clothing that's a little odd or out of date, like kind of stands out, but not enough that it's like profoundly strange, just enough that it's kind of a little weird.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll approach a person either sitting in their car, or sometimes they'll knock on the door of a house, usually asking for help. But there's always something kind of off and creepy about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't seem upset. They seem very calm. It's usually very late, and it seems very strange that children would be out at that time. You know, so there's reasons why people don't just automatically help these alleged children.
Yeah.
And usually the person, gets a weird feeling and refuses, and then the children get kind of very insistent in a definitely creepy sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person still refuses, and mostly they leave, although there are supposedly some stories about what happens if you let them in, and it's usually not good.
Mm-hmm.
But that's sort of an urban legend. There's some debate sort of around the various communities about what those black-eyed children might be.
Mm-hmm.
But they do kind of tick a lot of the boxes for what we would say were fairies. Like if you describe that same story without saying it was an urban legend in like a folklore situation,
Mm-hmm.
it would fit some aspects of older folklore that we say. So I think a lot of urban legends, in another 50 years or so, will just be folklore.
Will just be folklore. Interesting. And somebody wants to know, have you seen any fairy folk, or have you taken any pictures of them?
Sure. So I personally, as I mentioned, I have had experiences since I was a child. I do believe that I have seen them. Again, always a subject that's up for debate, but
Mm-hmm.
I believe that I have. And not just the human looking ones. I've had a couple encounters with like fairy hounds and things like that. Pictures of them, I don't know that there've ever been any photographs taken that I think are genuine evidence of fairies, but I will usually point people towards Brian Froud's artwork, particularly
Brian?
Brian Froud.
Brian. Okay, got it.
Froud. Brian Froud and Alan Lee have a book, came out in 1978, I believe it was, called Fairies. And his artwork is pretty on point
Mm-hmm.
for what we see kind of described across the folklore. And I would say, with my own experiences as well.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. I was trying to think, if I feel like I've ever seen one. I feel like they're more elementals that I'm like when I'm in the forest, and when you like faces show up sometimes, like distinct faces within um leaves and stuff like that. I'm like, oh, cool. This is interesting. So when you're thinking about fairies, like what's the most important thing that we should be remembering?
I mean, I'm sure everyone who's into fairies would have a different answer for this. My big thing that I always try to emphasize to people is just to remember that fairies aren't humans, and that they do have sort of their own culture, and to be respectful.
Hmm.
Um, because usually when there's problems that happen, which often are when humans are having problems or getting hurt or running into issues, it's something that couldn't well I should say couldn't something that could have been avoided if the human initially had done something different. So
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. This is probably 10 or 15 years ago now at this point. talking to someone who had bought a house that had been empty for several years. And when houses are empty for a while, they have a tendency to end up having things move into them that, humans might not always be able to see. And she moved into this house after she bought it and started doing all this renovation. And she was having some issues, but it didn't seem like a haunting, like a ghost kind of situation. And she was putting up a lot of wrought iron. And iron, of course, protects against fairies. And one day she was standing on top of a retaining wall and got pushed off and fell and broke her arm, and was kind of, at that point, asking me, what was going on. And it's like, well, most likely you moved into a place where you had these beings who had also moved into that place. And now you're putting up all of this stuff that protects against them, kind of like pushes them out. So of course they're upset, the same way anything would be that was already living there,
right.
for lack of a better term.
Do you think that's why like people do clearings? Like a lot of people use sage or Palo Santo or sweetgrass to smudge and clear a space. Would that be in line with, being respectful while asking for clearing, or no?
Yeah, those particular items don't do anything against fairies. So that would definitely be a good way to go if you're not trying to upset them.
Okay, got it.
But you're trying to clear out other things that might be problematic. Of course, there's a whole other big argument about white sage, which we don't need to get into. But there's things you can do that are not going to necessarily offend the fairies, but would get rid of any other negative energy that's around and would help with that. Iron is always going to be something that's going to be unpleasant. It's, when it comes to fairies, if you start putting a lot of iron up, if you're burning things like mugwort, which does get rid of fairies, then that would cause you problems.
Got it. Okay.
One of the things I actually tell people a lot of times, if they're not sure what's going on, if they're having a situation and they're like, it might be a ghost, it might be a fairy, it might be, option C, because there's a lot of other things out there, is try doing something like sweetgrass or Palo Santo or desert sage, culinary sage even. And if that doesn't do anything, then you're not dealing with a human ghost, and you could more likely be dealing with something that fairy, and then you have to take a very different approach to it.
What, Morgan, what really ticks them off? What is and what makes them happy and delighted?
So basically besides putting up a lot of iron,
besides that,
they really don't appreciate disrespect. So saying things like, I don't believe in that, or, that's silly, or that's for children, that can cause people problems. Or they really are not fans of, I'm trying to think of a really nice way to say this, because I know we're on the live stream, human waste.
Human waste.
Go with that.
Okay.
Or animal waste, as the case may be. That's actually something that's been used historically for protection purposes, particularly urine, because they really don't like that, and they will not be anywhere around that. So not that I'm encouraging anyone listening to this to use that, but they can be, it's good to be aware of this. And they can be offended by it. So, if you have a dog and your dog has decided it wants to go in this one particular part of the yard, and all of a sudden you're having all these weird problems, maybe don't let your dog go over there anymore.
Something to consider.
Maybe find it a new spot and then see if that settles things down. What makes them happy? I mean, kind of the opposites of that, like being respected. I mean, everyone likes being respected, so that's always a safe approach.
Right. Yeah.
Right. They do tend to like cleanliness and order. So they're more drawn to people that are naturally sort of like that. They like happy people, people that are, more likely to be singing and happy and in a good mood. I don't know that there's anyone like that right now for the last 2 years with the pandemic, but if there's anyone left who is humming and singing and cheerful,
right. If there's always things to be happy about. There's always things, and there's always things to be not so happy about. So it's all a spectrum.
The fairies would love you though.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's my next question. How do you know? How do you know if they're around or they're not around?
You can usually tell. I will say that a lot of the stuff you'll see online about, you can tell fairies are around because of, and then there's a list. Most of that is usually not particularly accurate, but if you tend to just always kind of have good luck, because luck is a big thing with fairies. If they're angry with someone, you will have the worst luck with everything, even stuff that you shouldn't need luck with, it'll be bad. If they like you though, things will just always kind of tend to go your way somehow. If they're around, you'll also notice things like the feeling in certain places will be lighter. Like we were just talking about being happy in general. Like if you always kind of find that if you go out in your yard or in a certain room in your house, you just always feel happy there. But you're not quite sure why. Sometimes that can be an indication that they're around. Fairy rings are a classic folklore thing. A fairy ring can be a circle of mushrooms, which is kind of the classic one everyone recognizes, but also a circle of dead grass, of darker green grass, of flowers. It would be a perfect circle, just to be clear, because I know sometimes people will send me pictures and be like, is this a fairy ring? And it's like, well, not really. It's said to be made when they dance. So fairies love dancing. It's one of their favorite things to do. They do.
Oh, cool.
Love dancing. So the idea is that that night they'll go out and they'll dance in places that they're fond of. And in the morning it leaves these rings, whether it's mushrooms or green grass or dead grass or what have you. So that can be something, if you notice that, maybe not just seeing one, but if you notice that you're seeing a lot of them around you, that can be an indication that they're kind of around.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah. Thank you. And in terms of like real and fake, there's a lot out there. And so I would really love to know how you personally distinguish between what to lean into and like what to just don't even bother with it.
That's such a complicated question.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. I mean, at this point for me, it's a little more nuanced because I'm so familiar with the material. So there's certain things I can see and I can immediately identify, okay, this is coming from Dungeons and Dragons, or this is coming from Changeling the Lost, which is another role-playing game, or this is from Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, because a lot of that material has kind of worked its way into particularly social media. Things get shared around. Generally the things I look for, to kind of weigh if it's accurate or not, what's the source, if people are listing a source, what is the thing actually saying, if it's very much taking the tone of like, fairies are wonderful and loving and happy and they just want to help humans. I tend to be a little more skeptical of that just because the bulk of the material that we have, as I said, fairies are not human, but if you kind of think of them the way you might think of other humans, like they have a lot of different motivations, they have a lot of diversity among them, they have their own agendas, and some of them are helpful and some of them do like humans and are willing to like, do helpful things for people, healing and all sorts of wonderful things. But there's others who, are kind of like that person that we all know at least one of, who just doesn't want anyone bothering them, and doesn't answer the door or their phone, or just wants to be left alone. And there's fairies like that too. So if I see something that's just overly fairies are just awesome and beneficial to humans, then I'm always a little skeptical. just because it's too simple of a view. If that makes sense.
Now, no, yeah. Did you want to finish on a last thought there? Or?
I have so many more thoughts there, so we can keep going.
Curious, yeah, please keep going about the fact and or like the fake and real.
Yeah, it's fascinating because so much of the folklore, and I was saying this earlier when I was talking about why I think the folklore is so important. It's really generational knowledge. It's stories that have been passed down. It's modern encounters people are still having. It's beliefs that are kind of based in actual experiences. Whether you individually believe those experiences happened or not, that is what is behind them. And then we have this whole other stream with kind of, social media that is much more looking at fiction as a resource. And, fiction is such a different kind of thing. And I write fiction. I love it. It's wonderful. I read it all the time, but it just has such a different motivation for why the story is being told. It's not that, okay, your grandmother's cousin drowned in this river and everyone believes it was because of this fairy that lives in the river that is known to be dangerous. And, so this is the story that gets passed on. So then children don't go there because they know it's not safe and there's this fairy there. It's not that sort of a story. It's just something that someone wrote to be entertainment. And so it has a very different energy to it, if that makes sense.
It does. You bring up such an interesting point with social media, because there's a huge complaint that people have about social media is the fiction part of it, how people contrive stories that aren't actually true to form, fabricating certain backgrounds and filters and all this stuff. Now, and then I'm thinking about what you just said and how it's so different, the two types of fiction, but also there is I'm trying to find the relation between the two and I'm having a hard time.
A lot of times what material we find in the fiction and even the role-playing game stuff is loosely based on the folklore, and they just take it and then sort of modify it. So I think that's an aspect of it that'll resonate with people. When someone is seeing something on social media that's talking about, for example, the king and queen of the fairies, and that fairies exist in these different groups and that, based on the seasons. That is something you'll see, and it comes from fiction, from, I'm going to forget exactly which novel, and I should know this because I wrote a whole paper on it, but it's like 2010. This novel that said there's 4 seasonal courts, and that's not something we find in folklore, but it's based on something we find in folklore. And I think there's an aspect to it that people can feel that bit of I don't want to say truth necessarily, but depth maybe. And so then that gets kind of passed on, and then people believe that and share that as a belief. So it gets very complicated.
You're bringing something up. I'm finding that there's a popularity right now, with folklore and fairies. These topics are coming back up in an awesome way, actually. Now, do you think that that is reflecting something like a wider desire in the collective of some sort, especially for this time?
Personally, I do. I think that what we're finding is that, popular culture, people who didn't grow up with these beliefs necessarily, but on some level maybe know that there's some truth to it, or feel that there is some truth to it. They want to believe, they want to have something to look to kind of understand. And I 100% relate to that. When I was younger, I had experiences, and my only context for it was what I was experiencing because I was really little. And that's what got me studying folklore when I was a little bit older, because I wanted some context for my own experiences, for, what I had been dealing with. And I think we see the same thing now, sort of in this zeitgeist kind of sense across the culture, where people want there to be more to the world than just what they can, physically touch and experience with the five senses. There's that sort of spiritual hunger that a lot of people have. And when it comes to fairies, I think that people were moving out of sort of this place where they were very much relegated to children and to only children, and coming back into a place where adults are embracing that belief. We have so many books, so much urban fantasy and fantasy written about fairies and elves and all of these beings. You have TV shows like Carnival Row, which was out on Amazon a few years ago. You have, there's a show, I believe it's on, I can't remember what channel it's on, so forgive me. It's on one of the many streaming services that are everywhere, about the Jinn, which is, a Middle Eastern concept, very similar to European fairies. It's just something that people really have a deep connection to and want some frame of reference for. Now, I'm not necessarily saying fiction is the best way to go about that, because I've kind of already established that I think the folklore is the better route, but I think that's why it's seeing this time in mass media and in social media and pop culture, because people want it. They want to fill that.
Yeah. And how has that, how have you seen that translate in your own life when you started studying more or practicing more and learning more about the folklore? Like, how did you do some practical applications, or maybe you didn't? But yeah, how did you see your life change and stuff like that?
Sure. I mean, for me, when I first started really getting into the folklore, first of all, it gave me that context that I was looking for. And it also made me feel less alone, because, growing up, I did feel very much like I am the only person who is having this and experiencing it. And, it's a lot of questioning my sanity, which is not fun when you're 8 years old, but, and then finding the folklore and finding like, no, this is something that humans have seen and experienced for, thousands of years. And that was very comforting, I think, on a lot of levels. It also helped me, though, not just with the context, but also by filling in those cultural gaps. Because like I said, it's like a completely different, I don't want to use the word alien because that also raises a whole bunch of other questions, but completely foreign culture in a way that other human cultures are never going to be that foreign. So when you start getting into the folklore and you start seeing these stories where it's like, okay, well, this is what you do in this situation, or this is what you don't do in this situation, or, if you want to make friends with them, they love dairy products. That's just a thing. You'll find across all sorts of folklore, from Tibet to like Africa, all over continental Europe. I don't know what it is about dairy products, so I can't explain it, but it's just a theme. You find it everywhere. So, you want to be on friendly relations with them, give them some butter, give them some cream, some milk, that's a thing they like. And that was the sort of stuff that I learned from the folklore that I don't know if I would have figured out by myself, at least not quickly. That would have taken quite a while.
So just for anyone that's tuning in right now, can you give us a quick recap of when we're talking about fairies? We're not talking about Tinkerbell, the Tooth Fairy, or the fairy godmother or anything like that. We're talking about an array of beings, is right? Okay, cool.
Yep, that's exactly how I would describe it.
Okay.
The word itself originally came into English in the 1300s, and it originally meant the place, the land of fairy. And then it kind of came to mean these beings that were connected with or associated with it. And I think that's where we get it as this general term. So it was anything that was connected to this world of fairy, came to be called a fairy. until the last 100 years or so. And then we get that diverging where, one use of the word is for the little Tinkerbell kind of fairies, and then the other use is still the sort of broad general term.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much to explore here, I feel like.
As we could talk about this subject for hours and hours and hours, and
It
we
just
would
keeps
still
going.
probably have more.
Yeah. And just going back to the Jinn conversation real quick. I grew up, I'm of the Indian descent, and I grew up hearing about jinns, and they freaked me out. I was super afraid because I was told that they live in trees and they only came around when bad things were happening, or if you saw a jinn, a bad thing was going to happen. And I don't know why, but please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was something about, the head being turned backwards, and it just image, like I being a kid, like it really freaked me
Kind
out.
of sticks with you.
Yeah, exactly. But now there's like a whole show about it, and I'm like, okay, maybe there's more to it. And talking to John yesterday, I was telling him that I was super freaked out, in my earlier years by ghosts and all these paranormal activities and poltergeist. What's that? And but you can evolve out of your fears around these things too. Is part of it is knowledge, part of it is experience, part of it is just there's nothing to really to be afraid of in certain regards. I mean, from a survival mechanism and perspective, of course. But it was an interesting thought experiment to be like, oh, cool. I was super scared of that thing back then, but I'm not afraid of it now,
Yep, definitely. And I think, there definitely are certain things in the category of fairies that should be concerned, should be a concern. And they're more predatory. I mentioned like the fairy in the river that drowns children, and that's a real thing in England. Jenny Greenteeth is her name. And there's, other similar sorts of things, especially the water
What are
ones.
they out for? Are they out for blood? Are they out for life? Or what do they want?
I mean, there's different thoughts on this, but basically it's predatory, whether it's they're feeding on the spirit or emotions, or that's debated. But
Yeah.
It's like animals on earth. As a human, like there are some you need to be concerned about.
Totally.
If you're out in the woods and you see a bear, like you need to back away slowly and do all the things to be safe around a bear, because they can potentially hurt you. But if you know how to be careful, you know how to be safe, basically. And the vast majority of things really do not want to hurt you or don't have any interest in hurting you. And some of them can be very helpful, And I think it's kind of the same way with fairies, if we put it in that same context of, there are some you need to be careful around and be aware of, in the sense of, if they want to be left alone, just leave them alone. Don't go to that part of the river if everyone tells you the stories about why nobody goes to that part of the river. But there's plenty of things that they might look strange, but they're not harmful unless you go out of your way to cause an issue with them.
Right.
And that's true of other humans as well. Most humans are probably just going to leave you alone unless you give them a reason not to.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you. And somebody in the comments here just mentioned that Jinns and Genies. I think that's what the show is all about. I think I could be completely wrong, but that's definitely something to consider. I never thought about Jinns and Genies going together. Interesting.
Yeah. I think Genie is the like English anglicized version of Jinn.
Okay. But is it the same concept of like this being that grants wishes?
I think that's a development in the folklore. The older concept of the Jinn is a lot more complicated. There's good Jinn, positive Jinn. I hate to use the word good and bad because that's got a lot of moral judgments in it, which I wouldn't want to apply here. But the ones that are helpful to humans, or want to be helpful to humans. And you do have some that are more dangerous, but it's a variety. Most of what I know for Jinn folklore is more specifically like from the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
So like some Jinn are Muslim, some are not, some are, dangerous, some are not. And I believe the show kind of takes that approach to it.
Okay.
There's sort of a variety of motivations going on.
Yeah.
I had a really good talk with someone who is from Ireland actually, but specializes more in Jinn,
mm-hmm.
and has traveled extensively and talked to people in the Middle East and in India. And he was the one who kind of got me to see the similarities. A lot of Jinn are also averse to iron. They like milk, from what he was saying, if I'm remembering this correctly. The story with the Jinn is that they were created from smoke when the God was creating everything. And that's a little similar to what we see with fairies, with the idea of them being spirits of the air,
mm-hmm.
Which they aren't all, of course. Like I said, there's a huge subject. I'm kind of generalizing a little bit, but it was interesting talking to him and seeing like how many similarities there are between the two types of beings.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you, Morgan. Those were all the questions that I had. Did you want to share anything else?
Oh, there's so much more we could talk about.
No. Well, why don't you tell us about what you're going to present on, or what can we expect at the conference coming up on July the 10th?
Yeah, I'm super excited for the conference. I'm going to be talking more about folklore and sort of the crossover with fiction and the way that people's belief can shape reality, I guess we'll say. I don't want to give too much away, so I'm trying to do like little teasers here, but
really,
we'll get into there's some really interesting theories out there about the way that human belief affects fairies and the way that fairies affect humans and what they believe. And so I want to talk a bit about that. And I think it'll be really great. If I'm allowed to say that, I feel very egotistical right now. But I think it'll be really interesting.
It's gonna be a good conference. Yeah, it's gonna be awesome. There's an array of speakers, that will be sharing a lot of content and knowledge and experience. So to go to portaltoascension.org and check it out for yourself. And we hope to see you there. There was one more question I had. It was about the veil. So the veil. Where is the veil at right now? Is it completely gone? Is it super thin? Has it gone thick again? What is happening with the veil?
Yeah, so the veil is a great metaphor for the separation between this world and the world of fairy. It tends to be the most open, I guess you would say, at October 31st and May 1st. Mm-hmm. So we're kind of right now at a point, because we're still in May, where you're still going to be having a lot more activity, particularly when it comes to fairies, than you would have at other times of the year. And that holds true generally for a good 6 weeks. Should go through at least midsummer, with things being more kicked up. The same way when we get to October 31st, it tends to last a good way, almost till the end of the year. Yeah, just with more activity, people having more experiences, people experiencing things more easily. Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to have experiences, but you always find that it's a bit of you have to kind of push for it. These times of year, people tend to not have to push as much. Things come more easily.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Any last questions here? I'm just going to check the Q&A. No more questions. Awesome. Well, we did it. That was exactly 1 hour. Wow.
Like I said, we could talk for hours.
I know, right?
About this topic.
There's so much to deep dive in with the various, I'm going to say, characters that come up, whether it's story or something else. There's so much that we can relate to back to our own lives as well. And how can this, be a catapult to us doing something different? I think that's what this is all for also, is pushing us into action of some sort, which is in like more alignment with nature, with what we actually want from our own lives, and the direction that it's going. So
Definitely.
yeah, I want to thank you so much for being here today and chatting with us and sharing so much about your books. Oh my God, your books. You have so many books. Can you tell us a little bit about your books before we head out?
Oh, sure. I do have way too many. Compulsive writing problem. I do write some fiction, but I have a lot of nonfiction. I just had a book on the Norse pantheon, actually came out May 1st, and I have a book on the Irish fairies, the Aes She, that's coming out July 29th. So kind of right in between those two.
Cool.
But
Yay.
I'm always got something. So
always something going on. Cool. So how
Yep.
do we how does someone find you?
Sure. I am all over social media, sadly. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'm always under my name.
Okay.
So it's just Morgan Daimler. I will say, because there's a lot of like weird scam accounts going around, I do not charge people for consultations
Or
or readings.
Yeah.
I don't really do readings. I will never message someone out of the blue and be like, please give me money.
Yeah.
Like,
I know, man. It's
that's
like
not me.
I know. I have friends that they've gone through the same thing, and yeah, it's very awkward.
It is. It is. So I'm just putting that out there for everyone. I am easy to find on social media, but if you think it's me and then I'm asking you for money, it's not really me. I promise.
No. Cool. So check out Morgan's website, check out portaltoascension.org. Morgan, thank you so much again for being here. We'll see you at the conference. And I want to thank you guys all for watching and tuning in. I'm Raji, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye. Bye.